Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast on its ever-forward journey towards being the Groundwork podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is a pleasure to be here with you this week on the Winter Solstice. And the darkness is going to form the core of today's conversation, and I can't wait to have it with you. But because our guest today loves poetry, I thought I'd begin and end this rather long intro with Rilke. I encourage you to listen to the intro, but if you don't, may this episode lead you into the solstice with all of its many gifts. A deep thank you to our guest today, Francis Weller, for joining me, for the poetry he shares, both his own and that of others. And for now, Rilke. Quiet friend who has come so far, feel how your breathing makes more space around you. Let this darkness be a bell tower, and you the bell. As you ring, what batters you becomes your strength. Move back and forth into the change. What is it like, such intensity of pain? If the drink is bitter, turn yourself to wine. If this uncontainable night be the mystery at the crossroads of your senses, the meaning discovered there. And if the world has ceased to hear you, say to the silent earth, I flow. To the rushing water, speak, I am. I'm going to tell you a little very personal story at the front of this. In June of this last year, I was standing in the valley where the farm sits, and I watched a storm blow through. It had come on really fast. The clouds gathered in the west, and I remember feeling it coming and realizing that I had felt it before the goats, and feeling something deep about that. They were still grazing at the far end of the pasture, and in just a couple of minutes, they were making for the barn. And the rain was already starting to come down. I stood in the doorway of the barn with my alpha goat, his name is Cheez-It, looking west as the storm began to rip through the valley. A couple of days before, I'd actually been talking to a friend about trees we loved. Trees we couldn't stand to lose. And it had been keeping me up at night. Should I call an arborist out to check on these trees, my beloveds? The rain started driving sideways, and I looked on at this lone cottonwood. It's one of the only trees in the wet valley of the farm, and it feels like this call home since cottonwoods aren't as common here back east as they are out west. And I watched as this tree began to bend with the driving rain. I think I knew the gust was coming before it hit, but I watched this 50-foot column of old cottonwood bend right at the middle. It bent so far that it felt absolutely impossible, and its canopy touched the ground. I was standing in the doorway, and I had Cheez-It's horn in my hand, and I was screaming. You just couldn't hear it because the wind was so loud. I was positive the tree was going to come down. At the end, a large branch snapped, and it completely shattered. Wood splintered across the field, probably across an acre. And the storm was over as quickly as it had begun. And when I left the barn, I realized that another beloved tree, a maple, had fallen on the horse barn where Josh and the horses were inside of it. And The body of the tree was now laying where all of these other bodies that I love and care for had been just moments ago, and I was absolutely devastated. I grieve that maple still, and I try to savor the cottonwood every chance I get. This story goes a little bit deeper because the next month, I lost my mind a little bit. I, for those of you that know, had spent the better part of a year and a half alone on the farm. Josh had been in Denver caring for business, and there had been weeks where I had gone without seeing another soul. And I knew this wasn't the way. I knew that. I know that we as humans are herd animals, and this is not how we are supposed to live. We are not supposed to live in isolation, not in the rugged individualism that I think we've cultivated. It's not how we're supposed to live as farmers. This was always supposed to be a group effort. And I don't think it's how we're meant to live in the world either. And I knew I had been slipping, but I had been in dark times before, and I figured I'd find my way back. But that darkness of those 18 months just kept whipping around me, just like the wind had whipped through the valley, and I bent and I broke. And afterwards, I kept thinking about the tree and the shape we're made into by the wind. I kept thinking about how we bend, how we flex, and how sometimes we break. How much the darkness, how much the time I spent alone had completely changed the shape of me. I felt like the cottonwood that I am looking at now as I read you this intro. And I thought about how completely transformed by the winds of grief, of isolation, of hardship that I have been, that all of us have been transformed by these. And I know that parts of my mind were able to bend and others were only able to break. And in the aftermath in these months, initially I kept producing podcasts. I kept trying to just run through it. And then I just kind of came to this grinding halt. And as I've become to emerge from that grinding halt in this aftermath, I realized I've become a person that is completely unfamiliar to me. Not for the first time in my life. I am a totally new shape. Forged in grief, forged in darkness, forged in isolation. And I know this all sounds, and it honestly sometimes feels rather dramatic. It sounds like I went to Moria and came back, but as I thought about it, Gandalf says, and then darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time, and I wandered far on roads that I will not tell. I agree with that. I'm well enough now, and I think what you will hear in this episode is a message around grief and darkness that is deeply universal and very, very apropos for this time of year. I think, too, that this is a touchstone that we keep exploring in the podcast. And, this last year, it was an emerging theme. What happens in the absence of community? Both communities of humans above ground, of other animals above ground, the communities of soil microbes below ground, the way that these communities interact with one another, right? What happens in the absence of it? And I think at the time, I felt like that theme was emerging of its own accord. But looking back, I really do wonder that if in my isolation, I just kept pulling at that thread unconsciously, because it was there from the very start of the year. We looked at the communities of the built and natural worlds with Ben Goldfarb. There was Cole Mannix talking about building an agriculture, a community that we could live in, something that's maybe a little bit bigger than a valley, but certainly no bigger than a state. There was Melanie Challenger speaking to the human animal, the communities we had destroyed in our herds and the herds of others. Deb Chakra talking about building infrastructure around communities of care. Ferris Jaber talking about the communities that weave in and out of one another here on Earth throughout time. There was the incredible love letter to the emptying of rural America and its vital communities with Stephen Kuritz. And there was just the stunning, absolutely beautiful episode with Alicia Galvez looking at the communities of rural Mexico that were also destroyed by NAFTA. Community was there with Katie Bowman. She asked, what shape is community? What happens if we lose this skill of community? And it was there too with Brock Dolman and his 30-year community that he has built in California. Jill Winger's new community in Wyoming and the messiness of trying to build it. And I know in my heart of hearts that the wound of the missing herd for us runs deep. And I saw it in this year's episodes, both in what we have lost, but also in what we are building, right? I heard the grief echoed. We have lost so much, but I also heard the hints, the threads, the whispers of the joy and the messiness, the hardship, the worthwhileness, the grit in what might be possible. And throughout this entire time, I kept coming back to Francis Weller's work on grief. I was recommended, it's so funny, I actually remember the moment that I was recommended his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. I was in Texas Hill Country at a conference, and a girl came up to me and she was like, I think this man's work is for you. And I read it immediately and it resonated. And I had actually tried to get Francis on the podcast before, but he showed up at just the right time. In his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, he describes 5 gates of grief. And they are: 1, everything we love we will lose. 2, the places that have not known love. 3, the sorrows of the world. 5, ancestral grief. And the 4th gate, and the gate that I think we explore the most in this episode, what we expected and did not receive. I think in all of those episodes that draw towards community, I think some of it might have been my grief coming through. My grief for Earth, my grief for a deep bone knowing of what I felt like I was missing, this thing, the village. And I think I kept calling it that through all of those episodes. We need the village, because I was longing for it. I was longing for a warm hearth and a lap to lay my head in, a long table to share a meal at. I was longing for family and for friends and a group of humans with my interest and care in mind and theirs in mine. And it wasn't just a grief to receive. And I want to make that so clear, because it was also a grief to give. And I kept coming back to this idea that Francis reminds us of in The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is it is through our grief that we become aware of our need for community, but that we also need that community to help us hold the totality of our many griefs in this world. I kept coming back to this quote of Francis's. He says, "While many of us suffered mightily because of unconscious parenting, we must remember that our parents were participants in a society that failed to offer them what they needed in order to become solid individuals and good parents. They needed a village around them, and so did we. Of course we were disappointed with our parents. We expected 40 pairs of eyes greeting us in the morning, and all we got was 1 or 2 pairs looking back at us. We needed the full range of masculine and feminine expressions to surround us and grant us a knowledge of how these potencies move in the world. We needed to have many hands holding us and offering us the attention that one beleaguered human being could not possibly offer consistently. It is to our deep grief that the village did not appear." Francis also talks about a phenomenon that felt rather salient to share that we didn't touch on in the podcast, which is called the Rosetto effect. It was about a mining community that was in Rosetto, Pennsylvania, and they were so tightly knit, so formed on tradition and familial and convivial bonds that despite having similar practices associated with ill health, whether that was sedentarism or their occupation or smoking, their rates of heart disease were lower, and they were so much lower that they were something of an anomaly. And it was attributed to how tightly knit they were. But when mining left that town, their health outcomes actually declined precipitously, and they were as much of an outlier in their ill health as they had been in their good health. And there was this idea that this describes what it is to be heartbroken at that loss of the village. And I think that this effect, this Rosetto effect, seemed to explain so much of the phenomena we've talked about this year. I think that and holding these sorrows of the world. Francis's work on grief, whether it's in his book, whether it's in his courses, which I definitely recommend checking out, his grief circles that you've got to squeak into, they go fast. This work is so potent. And I think if you've been searching for why you feel the way you do, whatever that feeling is, you might find better ways of that shape, finding that shape in the pages of his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. I wanted to tug at the fourth gate at the loss of what we expected and did not find, this village. But what I didn't expect to emerge in the conversation was darkness and our descent. And I think when I recorded this episode, I was still very much in the silvery twilight or dawn of my sort of falling apart in July, and the freeze that sort of followed it. And I knew as Francis and I were speaking that this podcast was meant for this week. And I know I've been a little bit inconsistent in release schedules. I do have a bunch of podcasts slated, but I knew that this is what we, the collective we, this little village that we have formed here on this podcast, I knew that it was meant for the solstice, that it was meant for this point in winter where we find ourselves in the depths of the dark and where we light candles to guide us through the frozen halls of our hopes and dreams. And we stand back and we ask what needs to end for us to begin again. And I know I've had to ask some of those questions for myself this year. And I think that the solstice mirrors, those gravity-filled moments of our life, and that it is a time for reflection and for going deep within ourselves. And I hope that this conversation between Francis and myself can serve as a guide, as a bit of a balm as we navigate this time. I'm about to get to the conversation, but I do want to thank from the bottom of my heart our generous sponsor, Redmond Real Salt, who also generously let me take this little break when I needed it. In October, when I went out to Redmond and visit their team, I stood at the end of a mine shaft that was 80 feet high and surrounded exclusively by salt. I mean, just actual miles pretty much in most directions. Salt in sort of deep time, and at one point they turned the lights off and they left all of us momentarily in that black that is just so black that it is darker than anything we've ever known. And one of the many things that I found that was so profound in that was that with all of these beautiful souls that were next to me, they were new friends, and there was this deep sense of community that Redmond fostered in this very short amount of time amongst this group. And I think it was through that I didn't feel scared in the least. And so, it is my wish for us that we may find our communities in the darkness. And they've been so supportive of my work here. And I just want to encourage all of you to use their discount code mindbodysoil_15 at redmond.life to get 15% off so we can stay a little salty in this dark together. I want to close again with Rilke, but in a slightly different measure before we go on to this incredible conversation with Francis. Rilke says, "You, darkness that I come from, I love you more than all the fires that fence in the world. For the fire makes a circle of light for everyone, and then no one outside learns of you. But the darkness pulls in everything, shapes and fires, animals and myself. How easily it gathers them, powers and people. And it is possible a great presence is moving near me. I have faith in nights." I hope you enjoy this episode with Francis. Please leave a rating and review if you feel so called to, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode. There's more coming. I've been excited about this conversation for a very long time. I actually thought we'd start, and I'll tell our listeners that I was sharing with you a little bit about how your work keeps reappearing as we've talked about the loss of communities from both an ecological level and a human level. And that Daniel Quinn has made a couple of appearances in spirit on this podcast. And I pulled up a quote to kind of start us off. I debated about this a lot. I thought about pulling in some Rilke because I love that you always come back to poetry. But I pulled in this little Daniel Quinn quote where he says, "I have amazing news for you. Man is not alone on this planet. He is part of a community upon which he depends absolutely." Because it's something that has been, I think, really present in the conversations that we've had, just how absent community is. And one of the many gifts your work has given me is recognizing that absence of community. And so I thought maybe we could start there.
Well, it's such a fundamental element to being a human being. We don't exist in isolation. We don't create a self in isolation. Although that's kind of the psychological fiction, that it's all an interior process. But Jung had a phrase: the soul cannot become itself without an other, which is always found in a you. So we don't become ourselves without relationality, without finding places where the reflection and the mirroring and the attunement and the conflicts have chances to be worked with. And all of that happens in the mix of the village, of community. But what I see in my practice, but also in gatherings, is just how thoroughly conditioned we are to the mindset of individualism, I should say.
Yeah.
So even when we're in a community setting, we're a collective of individuals in a community setting. We don't know how to think like a village. Our thinking has been very shaped by the idea of separation. And this is not universal. This is mostly white, Western, industrial, technological, capitalistic culture that is fixated on this ideology of the individual. It's got its perks, right? But the long shadow of that is isolation, loneliness, depression, despair, overwhelm, and numbing, addiction. We cope with our situation. We don't know. We don't even think that it's abnormal.
Yeah.
It's what we breathe. It's what we drink. It's the basic foundation for how we're supposed to be, which is one of the reasons why we have such a high level of pathology.
Yes.
In our country. Go ahead.
I think you said something there that's so important. I think that there's this aspect where we've been inculcated in this culture of rugged individualism, which you refer back to in The Wild Edge of Sorrow, where we don't even know that it could be different, right? That there is something that we have forgotten. And to kind of pull us into that forgetting, you reference Quinn in a piece of work, and I often come back to, you speak of both amnesia and anesthesia, and you introduce that in a similar way that you just have in a quote where you say, "I also wrote this book to address the two primary sins of Western civilization, amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. These two sins account for an amazing range of sorrows. When we are lost in what author Daniel Quinn calls the great forgetting, we slipped into a mode of being that neglects the wider bonds of our belonging. We forget that we are all tangled together in this nest of life, that the air we breathe is shared, as is our water and soil, and that everything is bound together in a seamless web of life. When we forget, we are able to do untold damage to our watersheds, to one another, and to the entire earth." And I think that this amnesia that we're experiencing is it's so pervasive. And I think it is because we don't know anything different. We don't even know that we have been formed in this individual mold as a people that for 99.7% of our history were something very different.
Yeah, when we gather, it's as if some part of our archaic mind is quickened.
Mm.
When we get back into the original matrix of community, of healing, of belonging, some part of our psyche wakes up and says, "That's what I've been looking for." I can't tell you how many times after a grief ritual gathering, which usually takes 2 or 3 days, somebody will say something like, "I've never done anything like this before in my life, but it felt oddly familiar."
Mm.
That's the thread I am most encouraged by, is that the human design is ancient. 3, 4, 500,000 years of shaping, probably several million years of shaping that included that matrix of community. So when we leave it, it doesn't disappear, but it does go underground. And when we get back to it, like in a ritual gathering, it comes alive. It's not
Yeah.
gone. It's just kind of
Yeah.
dormant, waiting for the atmosphere to actually give the signal that, this is what I've been waiting for. This is what I need.
Mm.
This is what I require to grieve, even to give thanks. All of it requires that communal matrix.
Yeah, I was struck when I was kind of preparing this at how we need community to hold our grief, but our grief also exposes the need for community, that we are so fundamentally tied in to this place that we have these needs of these bonds and this sort of Penrose steps, this recursiveness of the desire for community within the space of grief.
Yeah. I mean, some part of us, and that's why in The Wild Edge of Sorrow, I talk about the 5 gates of grief. And you mentioned in our prior recording the fourth gate of grief.
Mhm.
Fourth gate is what we expected and did not receive. So I think part of our depression, part of our addiction is really that we know on some level that it should be different,
Yeah.
that there should be a circle around me in times of great loss or trauma, that I'm not required to do this all by myself, that I
Mm.
can't do this all by myself, which is one of the reasons why we distract ourselves with all kinds of anesthesia. But yeah, I think that's what we're hungry for, is the restoration of something that we expected and did not receive. That really is at the heart of our sorrow. We don't
Yes.
even know it.
Yeah. I
I
I
mean,
don't
that's
think I don't think we do, but we know it when we experience it.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
I pulled, when we talk about the fourth grade of grief, this idea of what we expected and did not receive, I pulled all of these different pieces into it because I think that this is I think the first thing I want to say is that we are not often told that this is something that we might be grieving, that we can grieve, right? We have so limited grief to the space of losing a loved one, and we can't often, I think, touch these other places of grief. And so, the first thing I want to thank you for is for really detailing and expanding that definition,
Mhm.
because grief is so fundamental to what it is to be human, and there are so many different ways in which we experience it.
Yeah, that was the remarkable evolution of doing grief rituals over many, many years, is beginning to sense what are people grieving?
Yeah.
And it's not just the death of a child or a partner or a marriage. There's all kinds of sorrows that people are carrying around in backpacks and U-Hauls and don't know how to name it, so you can't really grieve. You can't
Mhm.
really address what you can't name. And
Mhm.
so that's been a lot of the feedback for the book, is that you helped me identify these other places where sorrow is just adhering itself to my
Yeah.
soul. And to be able to name it, then I can begin to respond to what it needs.
I hope you're enjoying this episode with Frances Weller. It could not have been possible without Redmond Real Salt, who I had the pleasure of visiting in Redmond, Utah this past October, and even getting a chance to experience complete darkness in the depths of one of their salt mines. I have been cooking, preserving, and hydrating with Redmond Real Salt for more years than I can count. I love that it is mined right in Utah. It is packed with 60 plus trace minerals left over from an ancient seabed that has been protected from modern pollutants. I absolutely love their Relight hydration powder, and they now have a Relight hydration powder for kids and grown-up kids that is colorful, delicious, and lower in sodium, which actually fits perfect for me in winter. And those colors, I might add, are all from organic fruits, which is incredible. Their Relight hydration powder is packed with trace minerals, with bioavailable magnesium glycinate, and coconut water powder for something that's balanced. It's super tasty, and it's perfect for fueling life. Right now in my kitchen, I am using Redmond for a little bit of everything. It is going in soups. It is crusting roasts. I am still using it to preserve last little bits and bobs. I am actually using it to make cheese with the milk from my goats. And I keep a little crock in just about every room as sort of just a little touchstone between me and, the salt of the earth. I love that it comes in a variety of coarsenesses, and I also love that I can order a 25-pound bag to keep me in salt for months. I went through a 25-pound bag in about 6 months this last round, but I've been cooking up a storm. You can grab some of Redmond Real Salt's incredible products, whether that's their salt, their Relight hydration powder, their Relight kids, their seasonings, by going to redmond.life and using the code mindbodysoil_15 for 15% off when you go to redmond.life, or you can just hit the link in the show notes. Now, back to Frances. Yeah. I don't think without your book I could have seen in the last year of looking at the ways that communities have been changed by, I think, what I could only call just sort of the extractive tendencies of what has happened past, totalitarian agriculture, as Daniel Quinn would call it, right?
Mhm.
But to see that loss of community was such a grief. And you have a piece in here where you talk about Chellis Glendinning saying that we are born as Stone Age children, right? That our biology is hardwired for this expectation that there will be people around us to hold us, to witness us, for us to also witness in return, within place, to be bonded to that place. And I often come back to, you have this little piece you're talking about how often we look at what our parents might have done differently, and you say they needed a village around them, and so did we. Of course, we were disappointed with our parents. We expected 40 pairs of eyes greeting us in the morning, and all we got was 1 or 2 pairs looking back at us. We needed the full range of masculine and feminine expressions to surround us and grant us a knowledge of how these potencies move in the world. We needed to have many hands holding us and offering us the attention that one beleaguered human being could not possibly offer consistently. It is to our deep grief that the village did not appear.
Yeah. Yes. And we, again, are taught to somehow endure that
Mhm.
uh, solitary confinement, the sense of
Mm.
isolation. And frequently, the worst part about it, I think, Kate, is that we blame ourselves for that absence.
Yes.
We somehow think that this emptiness that's around me communally, I must have done something wrong. So,
Yes.
which drives so much of psychological enterprise,
Mm.
self improvement. Why do we have to improve ourselves unless the basic premise is that there's something fundamentally wrong with me
Yes.
that makes the reality of my loneliness justifiable? I must have done something wrong. And so I've got to fix and repair. I got to improve. I got to strengthen. Our obsession with this is almost always built on self-hatred. Like there's something fundamentally flawed about my character. Otherwise, we would have had the 40 pairs of eyes reflecting
Yeah.
backwards. We would have had the arms and hearts and hands to hold us in times of sorrow. We would have had all those things, but they didn't appear. So what did I do wrong?
Yeah. And
You
how
know?
can I fix it? It calls to mind there's a New Yorker cartoon from many years ago, and you can see a clear-cut forest. There are all these little stumps, and there's a koala clinging to a stump, and there's two mental health professionals, and they look at the koala and they say, this young koala has a mental health problem. And I think that our context, right? The way in which we are no longer embedded in place and community at a human scale, at an ecological scale, that milieu that we swim in is very much part of how these pathologies are manifested. And yet what you talk about in this myth of progress and of fixing, and the industry of fixing these things because of the shame that we feel, or the brokenness that we feel, that
Hmm.
the village didn't appear, and that it must be our fault. I think that it fills me with heartbreak to see it.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly was enthralled with the self-improvement uh, invitation because of all the shame I carried. That somehow, if I could just, reshape myself for a degree of approvability, they
Mhm.
might let me in.
Yes.
But the problem with this obsession, which I think is massive in the collective body of North America, this collective obsession with self and self improvement means that we abandon the world.
Mm.
You get what I'm saying?
Yes.
So
We go inwards.
my gaze is always turning inward. Nothing wrong with that. We do need to pay attention. But the world loses our gaze. The world loses our attention. The world loses our affection
Mm.
when I become so preoccupied with the enterprise, the agenda of self and self improvement. And that's one of my deep gratitude to James Hillman. In his book, The Thought of the Heart and the Soul of the World, talks a lot about the way that psychology has, in a sense, uh, taken soul out of the world.
Mm.
And it established it solely within the confines of my individuality. And we can see the outcome of that, right? When
Yeah.
a forest, which should engender deep imagination and relationality, is seen only as board feet. When everything is reduced to commodity, that's a loss of soul.
Yes.
Because if you are ensouled, there's an old alchemical phrase by Michael Sendivogius. He said, the greater part of the soul lies outside the body.
Hmm. Mm. I
So what
love
I
that.
feel like with you right now, there's an overlap, right? There's a meeting place, even online. There's a
Mhm.
meeting place where the overlap is touching and we feel connected.
Mhm.
But the same thing, you walk into a forest, if you're feeling your soul, you feel immediately as if you are in meeting cousins and distant relatives, and
Yes.
we feel it.
Yes.
And so you can't treat the world the same way if there's an intimacy,
Mm.
if there is a quality of relationship and familiarity with these others, the whole game changes.
Mm.
But our symptomology right now of massive consumption and denuding the world of its vitality and its beauty, how else can we describe that other than to soul loss, or what the
Yeah.
traditional people here sometimes call wetiko, or kind of a madness, a
Yeah.
psychosis,
Yes.
um, built upon emptiness. I mean, we don't
Yes.
talk about emptiness. I was on a program last week, and the interviewer asked, "So, if you got a chance to speak to the COP29 gathering,
Mm. Hmm.
what would you say?" I said, "I would spend my entire time talking about the legacy of white emptiness.
Mm.
This is at the heart of all our sorrows," I said. Racism, ecological destruction, race and gender. I mean, all of these things are founded on the emptiness of white culture.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that we have been basically stripped of all the underpinnings of soul based living.
Yeah.
No village, no language, no rituals, no songs. Um, I'm being extreme here. Of course, we have songs, but those things that create living culture.
Mhm.
We don't have living culture. We have kind of a unruly society,
Mhm.
which is really in trouble right now. By the way,
Mhm.
seriously in trouble.
Mhm.
Um, but this emptiness is something that we have to address. And one of the things that comes with emptiness is profound sorrow.
Mhm.
I remember in my 40s, early 40s, um, sitting on the couch with my wife, sobbing, saying, "I just got here." Because of those first 40 years of my life were basically lost.
Yeah.
I have almost no memory of those first 40 years. I was
Yeah.
performing my life. I wasn't in
Yes.
my life. I was trying to be somebody special and, get attention, get the things that that emptiness could not satisfy.
Mhm.
So, just sitting there feeling just how brief a time I have now to show up and to participate and to engage and to touch and to be touched. What that emptiness is really hungering for is some sense of deep belonging,
Yeah.
that I'm actually here.
Yes, to be in a space and know that just by witnessing, we are not alone, right? That there is a reciprocity. I always come back to Andreas Weber has a beautiful little piece where he talks about, I mean, we are constantly in exchange with the outside world. We take in oxygen that's been released from plant tissues and we exhale carbon dioxide that becomes that. And you said something that and I think it was in a podcast where you talked about the opposite of emptiness, not being this fullness that we so often spend the first bit of our lives seeking, but embeddedness, that it is those deep connections. And I want to offer that. And I want to offer one other piece as you were speaking about sort of how we move through the world as individuals without that doesn't allow us to connect, that doesn't allow that embeddedness to unfurl those tendrils of knowing that we are a part of a forest, a part of a neighborhood, a part of the dirt and the ecosystems that are around us. And it's something that I've been thinking about. And my friend Rob Terry runs a 3,500 acre forest near me, in trying to keep it in great shape. And we were talking one day, and he was talking about orienteering and reading maps. And he said that he found it so interesting that it used to be that when you pulled out a map, you had this great expanse that you knew that you were deeply inside of, and that you had to figure out how to navigate this expanse, but that expanse was at the center of your idea of how you moved through it.
Mm.
And now we have GPS, and on our phones we pull up this map, and there's this little blue dot in which we are always at the center of the map. And so maybe I'll just offer you that because it's something that's been on my mind, and I think it speaks to that inwardness when so much of required that is required in being embedded is to have a sense of being outward, of unfurling.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I threw about 4 thoughts going through my mind at once.
Take your time.
Um, one of them is that one of the most important tasks for us at this point, particularly again in this culture, is to learn how to uncenter ourselves.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is our loneliness is partly fixed on the idea of individualism that has me as the center of the cosmos. But if I lived in a multi-centric world where everything becomes a speaking, everything becomes a point of relationality, my loneliness is gone.
mm,
But that means having an imagination that can see how everything has a subjectivity to it. The
mm,
trees, the stones, the turtles, the salmon, everything becomes a form of speaking. That if we had enough humility, we would listen,
yeah.
which is what our deep time ancestors knew how to do.
Mm,
Because their survival wasn't an altruistic thing purely; it was also a survival thing. You had to know the moods of the animals. You had to know the way the weather was moving. You had to know when to move your camp. This was how we survived, was through being in relationship to the field around us.
mm.
So yeah, I think that's again part of our deep loneliness is having forgotten all our relationships. I share a story periodically in 2020, um, before that election. I was heading to bed, full of dread and depression, just feeling that here we go again. And I was literally, my leg was up in the air, about to get into bed when something turned me around and took me into my office at home and to bookshelves and reached for a collection of off the shelf. And it was by Linda Hogan, who's a Chickasaw writer, and the book was called Dwellings. And I opened the book up just randomly to the chapter, All My Relations. And I realized in that moment I had forgotten all my relations. My despair was in part related to how isolated I was in my mind. So in my mind, I extended out to the star clusters and to the moon and to the redwoods and to the Doug fir and to the ferns and to the sorrel and to the moles. I began to remember I am embedded in this incredible network of life. And I am not a powerless, impotent little critter that's going to be crushed by the weight of an election. I refuse. But that means I have to remember continuously all my relations, all my relations. I am part of this wide, exuberant, rambunctious network of kinship. And if I remember that, no matter what happens politically, I've got ground beneath me.
Mm.
And we need that. I wrote a piece recently. I have a collection of essays that are coming out next year. And I added an essay to it called Medicine for the Long Dark,
Mm.
because I believe the period we're in right now is what I'm calling the long dark.
Yeah.
And it could be several generations
Yeah.
if we make it. If we make it. We don't know. But
No.
it's going to be at least 2 generations before we have some sense of being able to get through this incredible narrow passage as a species and as a
Mm.
planet. Um, why was I telling you that?
You were headed towards a sense of embeddedness and relation um, within
After
that
my
space.
despair
Yeah.
story, yeah, yeah,
After your
yeah,
despair story.
yeah. Well, we'll just let it go there. Yeah.
That's
If it
okay.
comes back around, we'll pick it up.
No, I love that because I think that the long dark and I've heard you talk about this is a good place for us to just kind of sit in for a minute because I think I do think we're on a very bottleneck, a very narrow bridge, a very tight space in which we must begin to reimagine. One of the guiding quotes of this year's podcast has been from David Graeber. I don't know if you've read any David Graeber, but he has this great quote. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something that we make and could just as easily make differently. And one of the things that I think we get caught up in this myth of progress, which you write about so beautifully, is the ascent. And to me, to traverse this narrow bottleneck, this sort of precarious bridge from here to wherever comes next, this multi-generational bridge, is to descend. It is to go into the dark, to let go of the idea of progress, of ascension, and to begin to compost what was into potentially, hopefully, what is not promised, which is what could be.
Yes, you know, I like that you're bringing that in because we don't like talking about the descent.
No.
We love ascension.
Yes.
We like things going up. Stock
Yes.
markets, erections, everything's always up.
Yes. Everything is up.
Everything's up. And we're going down.
Yes.
We are being brought down, I think, with intentionality almost by the soul of the world.
Yes.
Um, if we can
Because
imagine that the world itself has a soul, this is part of its immune response.
mm,
That the systems of ascension, which we've been dominated by for at least 2 to 4,000 years
mhm,
in our ideologies, uh, have created all of these structures, capitalism, racism, all of these structures have emerged out of that. And so, what I think is happening is we are being taken downward. And that's where you have to begin to turn to soul. Because soul, that's the territory of soul. We talk about having a deep conversation, or that person has a lot of depth to
mm.
them, or you know, there's a certain quality of almost whispered intimacies in that space of descent. It's also a place of not knowing. We
Yes.
don't have a clue what's going to happen.
No.
There's this wonderful term, I don't know if you've heard this one, kartsaluni.
Mm-mm.
Kartsaluni is an Inuit word up above the the Arctic Circle. And kartsaluni translates sitting quietly together in the dark,
Mm.
waiting expectantly for something creative to burst forth. That's where we are right now, Kate.
Yes.
But we don't know how to sit quietly together in the dark. We're always trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
We're not going to think our way through this mess.
Mm,
It's going to require a deep listening to hear from
mm.
the dreaming earth what it is we need to do to suture the tears in our relationship to the earth and to one another. This Kartsaluni idea is the wailing people have to go into quiet and into darkness and pray that they hear a song from the whale people. They can't hunt until they've been given permission
Yeah.
by the whale people saying, one of us is willing to offer their lives to keep your people fed. But they have to receive permission. Now, we don't know about humility very much on this continent. We have a I want it, I'm taking it kind of attitude. So the damage that comes out of that legacy of entitlement. I often write about, well, not often, but I've written about how the ripening of a human being, usually through initiatory encounters, shapes them more to experience entanglements than entitlements,
Mhm,
more about rights or responsibilities than rights.
mhm.
You know, we focus always about my entitlement and my rights. That's
Yes.
individualism at its worst. But what if what we're being shaped for is entanglement and responsibility? How do I show up? How do I become a active participant in the sustaining and maintaining of living culture. And living culture always is in reciprocity with the green world, the living world. It cannot not be.
Yeah.
But when we forget that, we have what we have right now.
I mean, I Kartsaluni. I just wanna repeat that because I'm taking that with me and what it would mean to sit and to not, and I want to point at something you said, to not think our way through this. That we have to listen our way through this, that we have to feel our way through this, and that I think it requires us to sit with the unknown, to sit with silence, to sit with discomfort, and to sit with grief. And I think those are all things that we are actively avoiding, and that culture has created in many ways. Mother culture has created all of these things to fill and to anesthetize, to narcotize all of those spaces. That those are when we're constantly reaching, how can I get out of this space, because it doesn't feel comfortable. And
No. Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, that speaks to our lack of education about darkness.
Mm,
Because again, when you're so light-sighted and light fixated,
mm,
when light is good and dark is bad,
yeah.
when light is up and dark is down, um, you avoid it. And so we don't have much of an education in the darkness. I'm glad you mentioned Rilke before because he's a prime teacher in the
He
value
is.
of darkness and the descent, and but it was one of his lines, and yet no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence.
Mm,
See, that's a beautiful way to imagine the darkness, not as some territory of failure or punishment, but actually a fertile and rich gestational space in which new roots, shoots, microbes, mycelia could begin to percolate up through our own psychic imaginations and begin to feel that entanglement again, most viscerally that we could feel it again. So that's the darkness I'm wanting to espouse. And no matter what work you do right now, psychologically, we're being asked to go into that darkness. And the values in the darkness are very different than the values in the light. And
mm,
yet you named a few: silence, deep listening, not knowing, letting go, uncentering.
yeah.
And these are so un-American in
Very.
our dominant ideology, but they're also what soul's asking from us right now. Restraint, which is one of my favorite values to talk about because it is not talked about any place
No.
on this continent. We have the whole abundance ideology, all the positivisms and what we're entitled to. I should be able to wish for anything. It's fine, but what about restraint? Again, knowing how to pause in my acquisition, my claiming, my entitlement, but begin to see through restraint my interdependence with the others that also need food and water and shelter and love and community. Yeah.
As you were speaking, I want to tease something out, which is you talked about darkness being a very fertile space. And when I think about some of the some of our sort of cultural, not cultural, but some of the, I don't know, deep soul touchstones for darkness, they are inside the womb. They are spaces of deep entanglement. It is the Big Bang. They are the places from which life unfurls. It is inside of the soil, right? Where roots and mycorrhizal fungi and this entire food web of animal and bacteria and mineral are exchanging the very nutrients for life. That sacred bond between mother and child in utero. The darkness is in some ways the sort of very beginnings of our entanglement, like that first unit of deep entanglement, and to return to it, and to I just, in some ways, I have more of an image than I do words to share with this, right? Is that we go into the soil as a seed and we're contained, right? There is this sort of unit of self that is the seed. But in the darkness, it breaks open and it develops roots and it begins to touch the fungi and all of these bacteria and all of these different spaces. And so it is where one becomes entangled with and becomes many.
Good image. Let's open it up a little bit further too here, Kate, about darkness in the alchemical tradition,
Mm.
which I'm very fond of. I love reading about alchemy. Uh, they say that the very initial movement of soul making happens through what they call the negredo, the
Mm.
blackening. So this is what starts the whole process of creating soul or deepening soul or ripening soul. But this darkness also has a fierce edge to it. It's about decay. It's about endings and sheddings. It's about decomposition. It's not easy. One of the reasons why we're so resistant to this descent is that we know that this also implies endings.
Mhm.
There will be endings, and some of
Mm.
them absolutely necessary endings. Capitalism has to end.
Yes.
It's a parasitic system,
Yes.
eating us to death, consuming us to death. That has to die. So in the Negredo, paradigms, structures, ideologies crumble, whether that's happening to us individually. We all go through Negredo moments when how I held the world just doesn't work anymore. And we feel this internal collapse, this kind of this shedding of an old way of being in the world. Well, we're going through that right now collectively as well. This darkness means we have to look at what has to end here. And we can see the rising movement of resistance to push back against racist ideologies and capitalistic control and domination. We're seeing the movement of soul quickening in people. I can just see it in my own grief work that when I first started, there was nobody. I had to convince people to come to a grief gathering. But now, 20 years later, 25 years later, they're everywhere.
Mm.
I see advertisements all the time for a grief ritual, a grief circle, and I'm delighted. You
Yeah.
know, I'm just delighted that the denial. It's as if you talk about the seed, right? There's been enough heat and pressure to crack something
Mhm.
in the collective mentality. I remember when I was going to do a book reading. This is before my book got published. I self-published because no publisher
Oh,
wanted to read my book.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, this was 2010 or 2011. I just said, well, I have to get it out there, so I self-published it. And I would do local bookstore readings. And I was doing one in Marin County, and they were very, very sweet. They invited us to have lunch and they fed us. And they came out and said, if just a handful of people gather, we'll just have a nice little circle. I said, that's fine. I have no expectations. Well, they came out a few minutes later. Said, there's quite a crowd gathering. And came out a little bit later. Said it's standing room only.
Oh,
And this wasn't
wow.
because I was known. I was completely unknown at that point, but because of the theme.
Yeah.
Grief brought us together. Imagine that. Imagine if it's our broken hearts that might actually save our asses. It's because the heart cannot stay immune to what it's witnessing, whether it's with happening with women or people of color or trans people or whatever is happening. We can't stay immune to it. That's good news.
Mhm.
That the heart is breaking. That it's cracking open like that seed. And if it does, we are kind of compelled then to respond meaningfully to the sorrows of the world. And the curious thing is that when you do that, you feel much more alive rather
Yes.
than depressed and weighed down. So when we don't feel our grief, so I wrote about how people come into my office complaining of depression. And as I sit and listen to their stories, even for a little while, you realize it's not depression, it's oppression. It's the weight of undigested sorrows setting on them like sediment
Mhm.
and just, and probably for generations.
Mhm.
It's not even just their personal material, it's generational. It's not even just generational, it's cumulative from the whole neighborhood, the whole watershed, the whole state, the whole county, the whole country, the whole planet. We're weighed down by this. So to be alive is really crucial. I was talking to a group the other day, and the question came up is, well, what can I tell my 13 and 17-year-old children, 15-year-old children? I said, what they most want is to see you be alive.
Mhm.
It isn't that you be happy, but that you be alive. And
Mhm.
to feel grief for what is happening right now, if they could see you weep for that, that would bless them.
Yeah.
That would tell them in their own interior world that what they're perceiving out there is accurate.
Yes.
And what we want is our children to trust themselves. Because when we get this false narrative, when I'm working with cancer people at the cancer help program, sometimes there's, young parents, they're saying, well, we don't want to tell our children that mommy's really sick. And I said, you don't think they know? You don't think they can't see that your hair is gone or that you can't get off the couch after a chemo treatment? To confirm their perceptions is actually very affirming.
Yes.
And again, the goal isn't happiness, but aliveness. Grief is very alive.
Mm.
Grief is very, very alive and doesn't deaden us at all. It's our refusal to grieve that deadens us.
Mhm. I I have half a dozen things to say, but I wanna let's just go where you left us on how alive grief makes us. Because one of the things I noted, it's sort of 2 thoughts here. One is on aliveness, and you speak often that we find soul at the margins of culture. And that's I'm pulling a quote, and I always think about ecotones or edge zones, right? It's those edges that proliferate with life and aliveness, especially. And there's so much movement in them. And as I was thinking about your work in the lead up to this interview, and I was thinking about David Graeber, who I just keep coming back to this year. He passed in 2020, but it's kind of been a bit of a Virgil figure in this year's
Mm,
these episodes, and he talks a lot about how we've become stuck in the way that we make culture, right? That we're very dynamic people, humans, and we've organized ourselves in many ways over many millennia, right? 300,000 years, a million years. And all of a sudden, we've become very stuck in this structure in our own, domestication or captivity, which I know is something you speak to too. And
mhm,
even as you were speaking, I recalled a quote that Mark Fisher says is not his, but is often attributed to him, which is, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." Right. And so as we reach this place of ending and of darkness, this culture wide negredo, um, I was struck in reading your work that grief is not stagnation, it's movement. And so to go into this darkness, this unknown space, is to keep things warm and moving, to begin to compost something for reimagining something that is yet unknown. And I think that often we see grief as a place where we will get stuck or
mhm,
where we will get lost, but it is the very thing that moves us both outward into connection and through and in a myriad of different directions downward into this process of shifting, of change. And so I'm not sure what that leaves you with, but speaking to that movement and aliveness that grief offers us.
Mhm. Well, that's the predicament, though, isn't it? I mean, we feel this weightiness of the sorrow, but we're also kind of condemned to do it by ourselves,
Mhm.
and we can't. As I wrote about, grief requires two things: containment and release. And if I'm forced to be my own container, there will never be a release. So I will be in the process of consistently recircling the old griefs, generations of grief. So what we're waiting for, in a sense, is that communal circumstance where we are held sufficiently. And I can then do my one job, which is to release. So that's part of keeping it warm.
Mm.
See, when we avoid and neglect and push away, that creates a coldness in the heart. And whatever turns cold hardens and congeals. And then there is no movement. So if we can bring warmth to this place, this is an old alchemical idea that whatever's in the vessel, you have to keep it warm.
Mm.
Not too hot, turns to ash, but not too cold. Otherwise, there's no movement. And what grief wants is that kind of warmth that allows it to keep in the process of circulation. Because the soul knows that we are never out of grief. Most of the grief that we feel is not personal. It's not my losses. It's what surrounds me every day. Driving in here today, saying hello and and apologies to the dead from overnight, the possums and the raccoons and
Mm.
the ones that didn't make it back to their families.
Yeah,
You know, I can't drive by that innocently or
I can't either.
uh, immunely, or whatever the word would be, with immunity.
It's impactful.
But yeah, yeah, we have to let the world touch us. But your idea of we have to keep bringing warmth to this place. One of the chapters I included in the book is on silence and solitude. Because even though I'm a staunch, adamant proponent for grief work and community, I know that much of the time you face it will be alone. So, how can we even take that time where we sense our being alone and feel into still a wider network of others, ancestors, um, you know, spiders, and
Mhm.
everybody else is there helping me hold my grief too. I'm not alone with my
Mhm.
grief, but we want to keep it warm. Jung said that anything to change, three things are required. The first one is insight. We want to see things differently, right? We have to see that the way that I've been shaped by culture, by society, is not life affirming. I see that. But then I have to do the second phase, of which was endurance. Can I stay with the thought and not let it fall off the table like last night's dream, but
Mm.
keep it in front of me? Keep this reality in front of me so I engage it. I write about it. I think about it. I talk to dear friends about it. I paint it. I dance it. That's keeping the grief warm. Take it into ritual. That's keeping the grief warm. And that's what we have to do. Not determine where it goes, not to find some ultimate shape for that grief, because grief will become what it wants to become. My job is to keep the material warm
Mm.
and to honor where it's taking me. Grief reshapes us in profound, profound ways, as you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think even being struck by that, and I think you've spoken of compost before, and I have a friend who works she's a soil biologist. She talks a lot about composting grief, right? Because compost has certain elements are that speak to grief deeply, and I think one of them is you must keep it warm, right?
Hmm.
So that that biological activity is there.
Hmm.
But the thing about compost is that what goes in is completely transformed at the end. And to let go of the control over what shape that is or when it comes and to surrender, which is something I've been thinking a lot about in my life lately, what it means to surrender to that unknown and to let yourself be shaped, which I think is an aspect of embeddedness too. That it is when we are embedded in something, it is all of those tendrils of relations that first let us know that we are a self to begin with, that we don't exist without those connections to other, which are constantly interpenetrating that idea of self, but also that we are shaped in that and might not choose a shape. And I wonder, as we have held so tight to the shape of this world, right, to how we have made it, both on a self scale, but also on a cultural wide scale, that the keeping it warm and those rituals, as you mentioned them, is about accepting that we will be transformed. And perhaps this long dark is that space of transformation for taking a shape that we cannot know and is not promised.
No, you just said that so well, really, really well, Kate. No, we don't know. There is no guarantee. The invitation is to participate and to show up for this
Mm,
unraveling time, this long descent, and to get quiet enough. Going back to Cartsaluni, sitting quietly together in the dark. We're also not good on the quiet.
no,
We're
no.
we're a very loquacious culture. We like to
Mhm.
talk, talk, talk,
Filled with
but
noise,
but
also.
getting quiet and listening. I do a lot with ritual. Rituals have become like a keystone for my work with community because I see its power and what it can do. Um, but I also know that I can't just select a ritual from Africa or Native Americans. I can't do that. But the earth is its own dreaming animal
Mm,
and has given generously rituals to us that address who we are, the shape of our psyches in this culture, and how we can begin to repair the tears in our code of belonging and in our
mm,
relational field with the rest of the world. These rituals are beautiful. I remember one of my dear friends was Malidoma Some, who died a few years ago, and we taught together for about 5 or 6 years, and this ritual had come to me, and I did it with another group, and I said, well, I'm going to bring this ritual into our training here. And after it was over, he looked at me and said, that's the first indigenous ritual I've experienced on this continent. In other
mm,
words, that one belonged here. He said, you would not see this ritual in my village. That's not the way we need to heal or work with our material. But I see it's perfect for where you are, you know.
mm,
So we have to become receptive, porous enough
mm,
for that dreaming to enter us, and to let the reparative function of ritual do its work communally.
mm.
And I see that all the time. It's one of the things that we are absolutely bereft to not have these kind of ritual practices to address the commons of the soul, whether it's birth, death, grief, loss, gratitude, initiation, reparation, reconciliation. That's what ritual was. It was the means by which a community continuously repaired and renewed itself. We have Black Friday sales. Our rituals are around economics and around
Yes,
purchasing and consumption, but
yes.
not upon repair or healing or grief or taking our young ones through initiations, taking our old ones into elderhood. All of the things that we have abandoned and forgotten in this
Mm.
great forgetting that Daniel speaks about. Lots to grieve.
There is so much to grieve. And there is so much grief here to sort of pick up the threads of, right? And that almost asking to be picked up and held and touched. And I was thinking Two thoughts. Uh, to have a ritual that is of place makes sense to me, right? We are made of place. I think about
Mhm,
this a lot, and that
mhm.
for most of human history, we are constituently made up of the things that we eat from the place around us. We breathe, that we take into our microbiome that is on our skin. Like we are made of place, and so it makes sense to me that any rituals that we create must be born of that place too, and of listening, of getting quiet enough to listen to
Right.
what might come through. And again, that porosity that you spoke of, which I really love. And I want to transition into maybe asking this question about how we can create that container. And I have a piece somewhere in all of these notes where you talk some about homecoming and creating the space for this to happen, that we are often looking, and this really struck me on this reading of the book, that we are often looking for that community, for that space, but sometimes it's time that we become that container and that we create it ourselves. And I one of the first podcasts I heard you on was a Mark Groves podcast, and I revisited it in preparing for this, and I had kind of misremembered a quote, but it still sits with me, and it's how we turn the wound of not belonging into an invitation of welcoming. And within that, to create a welcome, a homecoming back into ritual for us to communally experience and pick up these threads of grief that are just laying everywhere around us.
That's lovely. See, part of the trouble we face is that most of the grief we feel or encounter is carried in a very young part of our psyche.
Mm,
In other words, that the grief we experienced as children typically was not adequately caught or held by partly because there was no village around us.
yeah.
So that grief kind of just got pushed to the side. Well, again, it's not a neutral thing, this movement. It generates gravity
Mhm,
and it demands ultimately to be addressed. And turning towards these pieces is not easy
mhm,
as an adolescent. So whenever it comes up, and I just did a 5-month grief ritual training for people in 31 countries,
mm,
which is also one of those signs that denial is breaking. I was delighted that that many people wanted to learn. But you get this feeling that the work has to move into the adult's hands. In other words, what I see in here in my office or in ritual spaces frequently is that when grief comes up, you'll suddenly see this transformation on the face of the person feeling it, and they'll suddenly become a 3 or 5-year-old child, petrified. They'll say something, "I have to get out of here. I have to leave right now." And I'll say, "What's happening? Tell me what's happening." So it's not safe. You're not going to be able to catch me or my grief, or you won't be able to hold me. Well, there's the child. I said, "Well, can you imagine turning toward this part of you for a moment and saying, 'It's okay. I'm right here. I've got you.'" And the moment they do that, they enact a movement of separation.
mm.
That's an adult move. And very few of us have that psychological capacity. When something grabs us, we're taken by it. We're taken over by
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
So to have the ability, particularly if that state is one that generates a child or an adolescent response, terror or rage, I have to be able to separate from that. So you're bringing up, I think, a very key point is that how do we migrate the residue of untouched, unattended grief into the hands of the adult? You know, that for me is one of the core elements of this work, is because grief ultimately is a ripening of us. But if it consistently is held in the hands of a child, it's all about survival.
Oh, I mean, that speaks deeply to me on a personal level. Um, and I'll bring in this piece, and I feel strongly about bringing this piece in. One of the quotes that I pulled from The Wild Edge of Sorrow very early on and have come back to often in considering what the community means in how we access that adult self, right? And perhaps how we begin to hold that child was you tell a story about a girl in a village that you are visiting, and her mother had thrown boiling water on her, and she
Yeah.
carried these outward scars, but you make note that she didn't seem to carry that at a soul level in the same way that we
Right.
might expect here in
Right.
Western culture. And you ask the one of the elders in the village about it, and they said, the village responded immediately and let this young girl know that what happened had nothing to do with her, that her mother was wrong to do this, and that she was loved and cherished by the people. And you go on to talk about shame, and that when we're held in community, it transmutes that shame at that beginning. But because we didn't have 40 pairs of eyes staring back at us, oftentimes these childhood wounds are deep, and like you said, when we hold grief, when we hold all the grief that we were holding as children, we become those children again.
Hmm. 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 Yeah, that was a powerful moment for me to realize how protective village is to our wounds.
Yeah.
How she experienced a trauma, absolutely, but that trauma did not translate into self doubt and self worthlessness. And it didn't metastasize into something uh, life changing, life shattering. It didn't turn into shame that could have. I mean, how many of us have had moments, not as egregious as that, but violations to our worthiness, our integrity, our wholeness, and then there was no reflection, no
Yeah.
mirror to counteract that experience, and it becomes again precipitates into truth that there must be something wrong with me,
Mhm.
and that's really part of my deep grief is the collective in this country spends much of our lifetime obsessed with that question: am I good enough?
Mhm.
Do I
Yeah.
belong? Am I lovable? And again, we're spinning on this side of the gate of initiation. Aren't we all frequently die having never tasted life on the other
Mm.
side of the gate? Where the questions are not about me, am I good enough, but how are the children? Is the salmon run getting stronger? What's the state of the village?
Mhm.
Those questions are not at the tip of our minds. They're almost always about, well, how do I make myself a little better today? And
Mhm.
again, we withdraw libido from the world. And we take the life force out of the world. And it's really feeling the absence of our presence there.
Where you take that story in the book, is that you actually shift into talking about the gifts that we have to offer the village. That so much of our grief is also that we are not able to get past that inflection point of spinning on the myth of progress and of self-improvement to reach the giving of the gifts that we came into this world with, and sharing them in a way that again brings us back into the connection of this
Hmm.
greater symphony of life. So bringing our whatever that is, I don't know, our clarinet, our trombone into this greater symphony, and to experience that. And I think in many ways that idea of creating an invitation of welcoming is to create a place for us all to play that music together.
And wouldn't it be wonderful if we knew that wounding is inevitable?
Mm,
You will get wounded. But what if that was an entry point into discovering one's medicine rather than a
mhm,
confirmation of one's unworthiness?
mm,
What if we could reimagine the wound again as inevitable? That's why in my work I love taking a mythic perspective because myth tells us to be human is to be wounded.
yeah.
All the deities are wounded. They all deal with affliction, so it becomes an archetypal truth that you're going to be wounded. From a psychological perspective, my wound makes me different and
Mm,
makes me exceptional. From a mythological point of view,
mhm.
the wound joins me to the other fact that we are all limping through this world.
Yes.
Let's go that way.
Yes.
Let's go towards a mythic understanding that wounding is not a commentary; it's an inevitability,
Mhm,
and it's in that crack, it's in that tear, it's in that cut that you catch a glint of what's possible around your medicine.
mm,
The old Greek phrase is, "In your wound is your genius." So I hated my wound. Shame is not a wound I would wish on anybody. That was my
no,
wound,
me
and I
neither.
carried that for decades with disgust. My first lines to my therapist when I really seriously went into therapy was, "I want you to help me get rid of some parts of me." You know,
Yeah.
I
I
went in
mean,
there for
yes,
that was
that
gonna be an
resonates.
extraction process. I just gotta if I could just get rid of my weakness, my inadequacy, my shame, my fear, I would be okay. I would present
Oh.
favorably to the world. Well, fortunately, I failed miserably at that task, and, they all have remained and have become my entry point now.
Mm,
The Malidoma, gave me a name. We went through initiation with him, and my name translates as "he who sets straight the bone."
mm,
In other words, the shame has become my medicine. I know the twists and distortions and contortions that happen in our depths because of that wound. But I can go there with you. They don't scare me.
mm.
Let's go look at them. Let's see if we can reset the bone and get you walking again, get you playing violin again. But, the wounds, in a heroic culture, wounds are considered failures. They're considered commentaries on your worthiness to be inside the circle or not. And so that's why I think the mythological approach really frees us up to say, well, that's your shape. Well, this is my shape.
Mm.
It isn't an exclusion, it's an inclusion. You come into, well, and then you bring up that whole thread around belonging. See, if you're caught in the obsession with self improvement, you already are under the belief that I don't belong,
Yes. You
right?
are making yourself into a shape that will better fit within what you see
Right,
in order
right,
to belong.
right. So part of that maturation process, again, moving it into the adult's hands is I can't keep looking for places of belonging. I have to become a house of belonging.
Yes.
I have to make spaces for my friends, my family, my neighborhoods to actually come into some felt experience of being inside of something that's real. And you can't do that when you're caught in the improvement process. You can't do that if you're consistently being triggered into a child state
Mm,
because a child state has nothing to do with belonging. It has to do with survival.
mhm,
I just don't
mhm.
want to get killed. I don't want to hurt anymore. So there, that part's just into making sure we don't absorb more pain and more suffering. But the adult, whole different ballgame.
I just thank you for that. I mean, you're speaking to me, but I know you're speaking to everyone, and I think within that, I'll just say this. I think that one of our greatest gifts in sharing our vulnerabilities and sharing our shame within community of building that is to be not special. Like the greatest
Mhm.
gift is to share something with someone, that twisted shame that has knotted inside of us that we're, constantly going over. And to have someone go, "Oh, I feel that too." And to feel the gift of not being
Mhm.
special And I think that the witnessing of community offers us that opportunity to become unspecial in the best possible way.
Best possible way. Yeah. A specialness is such a thin substitution for true belonging.
Yeah.
I mean, specialness is based entirely on performance,
Yeah.
you know, and it's also not a accumulated material. It disappears every night.
Hmm.
So you have to do the same shtick
Mm.
tomorrow. I have
Hmm.
to impress you again tomorrow.
Mhm.
Well, okay, I did a good
Oh,
job, and you did a good job, and okay, maybe they didn't kick me out today, but what about tomorrow?
yeah, it's a hamster
So
wheel.
specialness becomes again something you have to reinforce
Oh,
every day
yeah,
because you can't tolerate the feeling of not being special.
yeah.
No, it means you don't belong.
I wanna as we begin to wrap up, I wanna be respectful of your time. I wanna talk about this house of belonging and building it, and I also wanna bring in a little bit of remembering since we began this by talking about our amnesia and talking about forgetting. I also wanna talk about what it is to remember, and to bring in that idea of responsibilities over rights, of entanglements over entitlements. And you said something that struck me, which is grief is also about holding memory.
Mhm.
And I think through loss, that is, right? Grief is our new relationship with someone that we have lost. And so it is very much about a remembering as we seek towards, I don't know, going through this long dark with a hope of reimagining.
Yeah, and that essay I wrote around medicine for the long dark, I broke it down into three things. One of them is the medicine we need for the long dark, the medicine we bring to the long dark, and the medicine we find in the long dark.
Mm,
That we're not without medicine, we're not without resource. But one of the things I wrote about is the deep time ancestral inheritance is one of the medicines that we can bring to the long dark. We mentioned a little bit earlier today, Kate, about there's some part of in our psyche that recognizes these rhythms, these gestures, these patterns, whether it's ritual or community or whatever. Some part of us goes, yeah, that's what I
mm,
want. That's what I need. You know. Uh, so the remembrance is really about gathering together again what it is that we've been shaped by. So almost like we don't have to invent anything. We have to remember everything, everything that we have forgotten. You know, that's the practice right now. Is I don't think I've invented a single thing.
mm.
I may have given a different framework to some things like the five gates or something, but all I'm trying to do is stir the ancestral memory. You know, to call up our deep time ancestral inheritance. There's a rich reservoir of memory here about how to shape human beings and how to sustain living community. Because those are the two poles by which we survive. We can't have healthy individuals if we don't have a healthy village. We
Yeah.
can't have a healthy village if we don't have healthy individuals. The symmetry that existed for thousands and thousands of years has been ruptured. Now we focus, again, as we've said, so extensively on the individual, but there's nothing that helps to hold the individual in the context of living culture. So it becomes a solo enterprise, you know.
Yeah.
I'm going to just somehow promote myself through life. And yeah,
And they
great.
feed off of one another. Right? It is
Oh, yeah.
recursive. Again, the culture shapes the individual shapes the culture. And so you
And
have
that's in
these
our deep
Penrose
time.
steps.
Yeah, that's right. That's our deep time memory. And when we get near that, again, that rhythm or that feel, whether it's initiation or grief or, uh, marriage or whatever it is, when we get near the field, that's what gets stirred. And we have access to that. And that's why, my whole adult life has been focused on recalling this deep time ancestral gift. What's what I call the trail on the ground.
Mm,
And there's a beautiful poem by William Stafford uh, called The Trail on the Ground. Or no, it's called Watching Jet Planes Dive. I wish I had it memorized. That's one of the poems I haven't memorized. But he said, "We must go back again and find a trail that's been forgotten by everyone alive." You know,
Mm,
the trail is there. He
mhm.
said, "It's been grown over,
Yeah.
but the trail is still there." That's what Jung would call archetypes, where he called it the unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. Can't remember if I said that already, but I like the idea that there's an unforgotten wisdom in us that we can recall,
Mhm.
you know? We may not have any conscious memory of much of this, but we know it when we feel it. We have this gratitude gathering that we did for over 20 years until COVID hit. That is so beautiful. A 3-day gesture of remembering gratitude. Um, and the ritual is so stunning. We build these beautiful grottos that you crawl into on your belly,
Mm,
made of pine boughs and flowers and sticks. And the first time
mm,
we did this was in 2001 after 9/11 happened. And we couldn't break a contract that we had with this site. So I said, well, why don't we gather anyhow? And I have this image of a ritual we could do. And we built this first little grotto, and I crawled in there for the first time. Kate, it was like being in the lap of love. It was
mm,
so beautiful inside that space. And the kids, the children,
mm.
cannot not be in there.
Yes.
They want to. And then we create little clay figurines, and we bring flower petals and agates and cornmeal and tobacco and rose petals, and we give thanks. We crawl in there and we say what we're thankful for, and we leave a blessing in there.
Oh, wow.
And then on Saturday or Sunday morning, this is Saturday afternoon, and Saturday night, we have this delicious feast and we dance and we are just overjoyed. Then we come back on Sunday morning and the kids crawl in there and gather all of the offerings. And we process out to a space that's been opened in the earth. And for one day, for one moment, we feed her body. We don't extract in that moment. We feed. We say, I know this is such a small, insignificant offering, but please accept it and our apologies. And everyone, it's a gratitude ritual. We're all weeping around this opening as the children are putting in the offerings, and we all put a little bit of the
Mm.
offering in there. But it's so gorgeous. Yeah.
I
Mm.
mean, I can't help but recall, that imagery and imagining what that would feel like inside of that grotto, right? There is this womb like aspect, right? And we are all held by Earth here, by all of her abundance and the many, many, many gifts she gives without asking in return. And to return to that holding space and then to return some of those gifts to even give, one iota, one modicum of what we are constantly being offered and given. Um,
I mean, isn't that at the heart of this idea of remembrance, right? We need to remember to say thank you.
yeah.
You know,
Good
you
manners.
prob- Good manners.
Good
Yes,
manners.
yes. I wrote about good manners. You probably know Brian Swim.
I don't.
Well, Brian Swim is his technical term is a mathematical cosmologist.
Ooh.
But he and Thomas Berry wrote the universe story, and he's written a lot about basically the story of the cosmos.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful, beautiful. But I was at a talk one time with him, and someone said, so why are human beings here? We don't seem to serve any useful function. We seem to be more of a parasite. And, the earth would be better off without us. And he said, oh, absolutely not. We were put here to gawk.
Mm,
What a beautiful thought. We were
yes.
put here, he said, we were put here to be amazed. And the only requirement of us is to say thank you. That was the covenant. That was the agreement. It's all here. Everything you need. Just don't take it for granted. Don't feel entitled. Remember entangled. Don't feel like I have a right to this. Remember your responsibility to keep enough for the next generation. All we had to do was remember to say thank you.
Yes.
And we forgot. Thank you.
Mm.
You know? So that's part of our remembrance too, is having rituals of gratitude and have that be. We try to create a ritual calendar in our community here. So we either
Mm.
begin in grief and end in gratitude, or we begin in gratitude and end in grief. I don't know which it is. And then there are other rituals in between there, renewing the world ritual and the reclaiming ritual. And so these rituals that have been dreamt into our community over the last
Mm.
25 years, they become how we circulate around one another. And they keep our souls entangled and keep our gratitude flowing and keep the grief from congealing and becoming a place of deadness. And we stay alive.
Yeah. I know we're about at time, but I just want to offer that I think awe and wonder are, I mean, beautiful portals into gratitude, right? I mean, when you experience the absolute unlikely and stunning wonder of being entangled in this life, of all of the, I mean, I think about the fact that I'm 10% human all the time, right? That bacterial and fungal cells outnumber mine 10 to 1. And I mean, absolute awe at what it is to just be in this organism that I call Kate, that is really trillions of
Right,
organisms
right, right,
interacting with all of these other organisms at every second of every day.
right,
And I think
right.
within that, gratitude feels more present when we allow ourselves to feel that awe and wonder, which I think that we've become detached from, and just what a beautiful container you've made within your community and shared with other communities through your work to begin to create those cycles of grief and gratitude.
Yeah, thank you. I think grief work is really the linchpin here.
Yes.
That until we are willing to open up that lower register and really feel that upper register of gratitude or joy or
Mhm,
awe, will stay closed.
mhm,
So the grief work we're doing is not just you know for the benefit of feeling better. It's also totally entwined with my capacity to feel the whole range.
mhm,
Again, the goal isn't happiness, the goal is aliveness. And if I can open up to that territory of grief, I know the upper territories will open. As I shared with one of the women I talked to in the village in Africa, saying to her, "You have so much joy." And her response immediately was, "That's because I cry a lot."
mhm.
Not a
Yes.
very American response, was it? You know, but that was the soul's response, to know that those are in a continuous exchange. Grief and gratitude, right? I talk about that too. That is the mark of a mature human being. I can hold grief, but I can also hold gratitude simultaneously. I only didn't see roadkill on the way, and I also saw a magnificent sunrise as it was coming up. And the rains are about to come in. And you can feel it, and
Mm.
it's all right there.
There's a poem that I'm failing to remember. I'm not as adept as you are at memorizing poetry, but it talks about grief and joy threaded together, making this twine that you can't tease one out from another. That they are completely intertwined, and we need them both and need them to feel the
Hmm.
other, right? And that opening up that lower register, as you call it opens up our access to aliveness, which I think is a much better word than joy in many ways. Francis, thank you so much. I just really appreciate your work and what you are building in this world. And just picturing all of the communities doing grief work, the 31 countries of communities that are learning how to create containers for this through you,
Mm.
and what your work has meant to me in my life. And I'm just very grateful to have had this conversation.
Mm. It's been my pleasure, Kate. You did a beautiful job of guiding us into some good,
Mm.
deep water. And
Oh,
I hope your listeners drink deeply and are well nourished by our time together.
I know that they will be. Thank you so much. And I will have a list of show notes for programs that you offer, both online and your calendar, as well as the Wild Edge of Sorrow. Is there anything I might be missing? It sounds like there's a book of essays on the horizon here.
Yes, the publisher has it, but it's a slow process. It'll
It
be out,
is.
I think, next August. But,
Okay. Well, beautiful. I'll keep an eye out
yeah,
for that. I look forward to it, and just thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.